Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because, as we set up our tents in the dark forest, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we were being watched. The towering trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long, unsettling shadows across the mossy ground. A chill ran down my spine, and I found myself constantly scanning the perimeter of our campsite, searching for any sign of movement between the trunks. "Come on, Natalie, stop being such a scaredy cat," my friend Emily teased as she hammered the last stake into the soil. "We're in the middle of nowhere, miles from any other campers. What do you think is out there that's going to get us?" I forced a weak smile, not wanting to seem like the nervous one in the group. "I don't know. I guess I'm just on edge. You know how much I love being out in nature, but there's something about this place that's giving me the creeps." As we gathered around the crackling campfire, the flickering flames cast unsettling shadows between the trees, causing the forest to take on an almost sinister quality. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the eerie silence was occasionally broken by the distant call of a lone bird or the rustling of leaves. "Did you guys hear that?" I said suddenly, my head snapping towards the tree line as I heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping. "Hear what?" my friend Jake asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "That noise over there in the woods," I replied, gesturing toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "It sounded like something moving out there." Jake chuckled and shook his head. "You're just being paranoid, Nat. It's probably just a deer or something. This is their territory after all." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and the sound of rustling leaves behind our camp only heightened my unease. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. My friends just laughed it off, dismissing my concerns as the overactive imagination of a city girl unused to the sounds of the forest. When I volunteered to collect more firewood, an eerie silence fell over the forest, filled only by the crunch of leaves under my feet. The familiar sounds of the woodland creatures had faded, and the trees seemed to loom ever closer as if closing in around me. I quickened my pace, driven by a growing sense of dread, and soon found myself deep in the heart of the forest, far from the comforting glow of the campfire. As I bent down to gather a fallen branch, a movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. Snapping my head up, I scanned the surrounding area, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I saw a massive, hulking figure disappear behind a thick stand of bushes, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" There was no response, only the unsettling silence that had settled over the forest. Shaking my head, I quickly gathered the firewood and hurried back towards the camp, my mind racing with unanswered questions. When I returned and shared my unsettling encounter with my friends, they brushed it off, as they had done with my previous concerns. "You're just letting your imagination run wild, Nat," Jake said, tossing another log onto the fire. "There's nothing out there that's going to hurt us. We're miles from the nearest town, and the only thing we've got to worry about is running out of marshmallows." The others nodded in agreement, and I found myself feeling increasingly isolated, my unease growing with each passing moment. As we settled into our sleeping bags, the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify, and I found myself lying awake, staring up at the canopy of trees above, my mind racing with unanswered questions. What was that thing I had seen in the woods? And why was I the only one who seemed to sense that something was amiss? As the hours ticked by, the fire slowly dwindled, casting an eerie glow over our campsite. The shadows seemed to grow longer and darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me on high alert, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, I slipped out of my sleeping bag and stepped outside the tent, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily still, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. Shivering, I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and turned to head back inside. But something caught my eye in the distance. A massive, shadowy figure moved silently between the trees, its hulking frame silhouetted against the darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, as I watched the creature disappear into the forest, leaving me with a sense of dread that seemed to permeate every fiber of my being. What was that thing? And why was it out there watching us? As I slipped back into my sleeping bag, my mind raced with unanswered questions, and I found myself wondering if I would ever feel safe in the woods again. As I wandered deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of the forest began to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches casting long, ominous shadows across the forest floor. A growing sense of unease crept up my spine, and I found myself constantly scanning the area, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, my foot caught on a tangled root, and I stumbled forward, nearly losing my balance. As I regained my footing, a grisly scene came into view, and I felt my stomach turn. The mangled remains of a deer lay scattered across the forest floor, its once elegant body reduced to a bloody mess. Tufts of fur and shards of bone were strewn haphazardly, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I took a few steps closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Circling the gruesome kill site, I spotted a set of massive footprints in the soft dirt, far larger than any normal animal. The prints were deep and clearly defined, as if whatever had made them had been moving with incredible force and speed. An icy chill ran down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. A sudden guttural roar in the distance sent a shiver through me, and I quickly turned and hurried back towards the campsite, my mind racing with unanswered questions. What could have done this? And what was out there lurking in the shadows? When I burst through the tree line, my friends looked up in surprise, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of the campfire. "Natalie, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I struggled to catch my breath, the images of the mangled deer still seared into my mind. "Guys, you need to come with me. There's something out there, something dangerous." Jake let out a skeptical laugh. "Dangerous? What, did you see a bear or something?" I shook my head vehemently. "No, it's not a bear. I found this thing in the woods, the remains of a deer, and the prints, they were huge, way too big to be a normal animal." My friends exchanged a dubious glance, and I could see the disbelief etched across their faces. "Come on, Nat, you're just letting your imagination run wild again," Jake said, shaking his head. "It was probably just a mountain lion or something. You know how they can get a little messy with their kills." "But you didn't see what I saw," I protested, my voice rising in frustration. "There was something out there, something big, and it's not safe for us to be out here." Emily reached out and placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "Natalie, relax. We've been coming to this campsite for years and nothing has ever happened to us. You're just being a little paranoid, that's all." Despite my insistence, my friends remained unconvinced, dismissing my concerns as the overactive imagination of a city girl unused to the ways of the wilderness. I could feel the sense of dread building inside me, a growing conviction that we were in real danger. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, I found it impossible to relax. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the memory of those massive, ominous footprints, or the guttural roar that had echoed through the trees. When morning came, my friends were eager to set off on our planned hike despite my protests. I pleaded with them to reconsider, to stay at the campsite where it was safe, but they were adamant. "Come on, Nat, it'll be fine," Jake said, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "We've been on this trail 1,000 times and we've never had any trouble. You're worrying too much." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. As I watched my friends disappear into the forest, a sense of foreboding settled over me, and I knew that I couldn't let them go alone. With a resigned sigh, I gathered my own gear and followed after them, my heart pounding with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. As we trekked through the woods, an unnatural silence fell over the forest, with no birds or insects making a sound. The shadows seemed to grow longer and darker, and I found myself constantly scanning the area, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. "You're really starting to freak me out, Natalie," Jake said, glancing over at me. "I've never seen you this on edge before." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat as we rounded a bend and came upon a grisly scene. The mangled body of a hiker lay sprawled on the ground, their clothes shredded and bloodied. "Oh my God!" Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What happened here?" Before any of us could react, a massive, hairy creature burst from the bushes, letting out a bone-chilling roar that sent a shiver down my spine. It moved with shocking speed, its hulking frame barreling towards us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her back the way we'd come. We tore through the forest, our hearts pounding as the creature's heavy footsteps thundered behind us. I could hear the others' panicked shouts as we weaved between the trees, desperate to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before us. Suddenly the creature let out another ear-splitting roar, and I watched in horror as it snatched one of my friends, disappearing back into the undergrowth with its prey. The others let out anguished cries, but there was nothing we could do as we continued our frantic flight. "We have to get back to the camp," I shouted, my voice ragged with fear. "We need to get help." We raced through the woods, the sounds of the creature's grunts and snarls echoing all around us. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, pushing me forward despite the burning in my lungs. When we finally burst back into the campsite, our tents had been ripped to shreds, our supplies strewn across the ground. One of our dogs lay dead, its body horribly mangled, and the other was missing, whimpering in the distance. "What the hell is going on?" Jake cried, his face pale with terror. I told you there was something out there," I shouted, my voice tinged with desperation. "We have to get out of here now." As we frantically gathered what was left of our belongings, a thunderous roar echoed through the trees, sending us scrambling for cover. I watched in horror as the massive creature stalked towards our remaining friend, who froze in terror. With a sickening crunch, the creature seized my friend in its massive jaws and vanished back into the forest, leaving us shaking and helpless. Oh my God," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get out of here, we have to get help." But as we tried to make our way out of the campsite, the creature's guttural growls and the sound of breaking branches filled the air, and we knew that we were trapped. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my ribcage. Our panicked flight through the forest ended abruptly as we burst into the clearing where our campsite had been. The sight that greeted us was one of utter devastation. Our once cozy tents lay in tatters, reduced to shredded fabric and bent poles. Our camping gear was strewn across the ground, backpacks torn open, their contents scattered like confetti in a cruel parade of destruction. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. What happened here?" I felt my stomach lurch as I took in the scene. This wasn't the work of any ordinary animal. The level of destruction was beyond anything I'd ever seen or imagined. As we cautiously moved through the wreckage, a horrifying realization struck me. "Where are the dogs?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. As if in answer to my question, a pitiful whimper echoed from somewhere in the surrounding forest. Jake immediately recognized the sound. "That's Buddy," he said, his face pale with worry. "But where's Max?" We didn't have to search for long. As we rounded the remnants of one of the tents, we found Max's body. The sight was so gruesome that Emily turned away, retching. The poor animal had been torn apart, its body horribly mangled. It was clear that whatever had done this possessed immense strength and savage brutality. "We need to get out of here," I urged, my voice shaking. "Now." Whatever did this could still be nearby. Jake nodded, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "Let's grab what we can and go. We need to find Buddy and get the hell out of these woods." As we hurriedly gathered what little remained of our supplies, a thunderous roar echoed through the trees. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a deep, guttural bellow that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. We froze, terror paralyzing us for a moment, before survival instinct kicked in. "Run!" I screamed, dropping the backpack I'd been holding and bolting for the tree line. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I realized not everyone had followed. Turning back, I saw our friend Chris rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with terror. And emerging from the shadows of the forest was a sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that struck true terror into my heart. A face that was almost human yet twisted into something monstrous. Eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence and hunger. "Chris," I shouted. "Chris, run!" But Chris couldn't move. He stood there, frozen in terror as the creature, the thing I could only think of as Bigfoot, stalked towards him with purposeful, heavy steps. I wanted to run to him, to grab him and drag him away, but my own fear kept me rooted in place. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The creature reached Chris in 3 enormous strides. I watched in horror as it seized him in its massive hands, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Chris finally found his voice, letting out a blood-curdling scream that was cut short by a sickening crunch. The creature's jaws had closed around Chris's torso, razor-sharp teeth tearing through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. Blood sprayed, and I heard Emily's agonized wail from somewhere behind me. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished back into the forest, taking Chris with it. The clearing fell silent, save for our ragged breathing and Emily's quiet sobs. For a moment, none of us moved. The shock of what we'd just witnessed was too great, too horrific to process. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Jake grabbed both Emily and me by the arms. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now. Before it comes back." I nodded numbly, my mind still struggling to accept the reality of what I'd seen. As we stumbled away from the ruined campsite, leaving behind the mangled body of Max and the memory of Chris's final moments, I knew that our nightmare was far from over. The forest, once a place of peace and adventure, had become a labyrinth of terror. Somewhere in its depths, a monster lurked. A creature that defied explanation, that shattered everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And as we fled, the sound of Buddy's distant whimpering faded away, replaced by the pounding of our hearts and the rustling of leaves that might at any moment herald the return of the beast. I didn't know if we would make it out alive, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I survived this ordeal, I would never set foot in these woods again. The memory of that creature, of its inhuman strength and savage brutality, would be etched into my mind forever. And as we ran deeper into the forest in our desperate bid to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted, and that at any moment, those monstrous hands might reach out from the shadows to claim another. I ran, my legs pumped furiously, propelling me through the dark forest as branches whipped at my face and roots threatened to trip me with every step. The campsite, once our safe haven, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The image of Chris being torn apart by that thing was seared into my mind, driving me forward even as my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for rest. I couldn't hear Jake or Emily anymore. In the chaos of our flight, we'd been separated. Part of me wanted to call out for them, but a primal fear kept me silent. What if the creature heard me? What if it was already stalking one of us and my voice gave away their position? Or mine? The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees morphing into ominous silhouettes in the dim moonlight. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every rustle of leaves a possible sign of the monster's approach. I pushed on, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Suddenly, movement caught my eye. I turned my head, still running, and my blood ran cold. There, moving through the trees with unnatural speed and grace for its size, was the creature's hulking silhouette. It was following me, hunting me. Panic seized me completely. I no longer cared about stealth or direction. I just ran, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that abomination as possible. In my blind panic, I failed to notice the gnarled root jutting from the forest floor. My foot caught it, and suddenly the world was spinning. I hit the ground hard, tumbling down a small incline. A sharp pain exploded in my leg as it caught on something. A rock, a broken branch, I couldn't tell. I came to a stop at the bottom of the slope, dazed and in agony. "No, no, no," I whimpered, trying to push myself up. My leg buckled beneath me, and I saw the damage in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. A deep gash ran along my calf, blood already soaking my torn pant leg. I didn't have time to properly assess the wound. A crashing sound from above sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The creature was coming. I could hear its heavy footsteps, the snap of branches under its weight. It was close, too close. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to stand. Each step was agony, but the alternative, being caught by that thing, was unthinkable. I limped forward, my injured leg threatening to give out with every step. The forest seemed to blur around me, my world narrowing to the sound of my ragged breathing and the creature's pursuit. It was getting closer. I could hear its grunts now, smell its musky, animal odor. Tears streamed down my face as I pushed myself harder, knowing it wasn't enough. I was going to die here, torn apart like Chris, like the dogs. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A dark opening in a rocky outcropping. A cave. Hope surged through me, giving me a last burst of energy. I half ran, half crawled towards the opening, the sound of the creature's footsteps thundering in my ears. With a final, desperate lunge, I threw myself into the cave's mouth. I scrambled deeper into the darkness, ignoring the sharp rocks cutting into my hands and knees. Finally, when I could go no further, I collapsed, my back pressed against the cold stone wall. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own thundering heartbeat. Then a low, rumbling growl echoed from outside the cave. It was out there, waiting, hunting. I closed my eyes, willing myself to be as quiet as possible. My leg throbbed, and I could feel warm blood still seeping from the wound, but I didn't dare move to examine it. Any sound, any movement might give away my position. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dark cave. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror, listening to the creature's movements outside. Sometimes it would move away, and I'd feel a flicker of hope, only for it to return moments later, its growls sending fresh waves of fear through me. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my situation hit me. I was alone, injured, trapped in a cave with a monster lurking outside. Jake and Emily were gone, dead for all I knew. We had no supplies, no way to call for help. Even if I survived the night, how would I ever make it out of these godforsaken woods? A sob rose in my throat, but I choked it back. I couldn't afford to make a sound. Not now. Not with that thing so close. I pressed myself further into the cave wall, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into my back. My leg throbbed in time with my racing heart, and I could feel the sticky warmth of blood still oozing from the gash. But I didn't dare move to examine it or try to staunch the flow. Any movement, any sound could alert the creature to my hiding place. Outside, I could hear it moving. Heavy footsteps crunched on leaves and twigs, punctuated by low, guttural grunts that sent shivers down my spine. It was searching, hunting. For me. I closed my eyes, trying to control my ragged breathing. In the darkness of the cave, every other sense seemed heightened. The metallic smell of my own blood mingled with the damp, earthy scent of the cave. The rough stone scraped against my skin as I huddled there, trying to make myself as small as possible. Time lost all meaning. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror, listening to the creature's movements outside. Sometimes it would move away, and I'd feel a flicker of hope, only for it to return moments later, its growl sending fresh waves of fear through me. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. My eyelids grew heavy, my mind foggy, but I fought against it. To sleep was to be vulnerable, and I couldn't afford that. Not here, not now. So I sat, barely breathing, barely moving as the hours crawled by, waiting, hoping, praying that somehow, some way I would make it through this nightmare alive. But even as I clung to that hope, a part of me knew that this was far from over. The creature was still out there, and I was trapped, injured, and alone. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter into the cave, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. Somehow I would have to find a way out of this cave, out of these woods, and back to safety, if such a thing even existed anymore. The darkness of the cave enveloped me like a shroud, pressing in from all sides. I huddled against the cold, damp rock, my injured leg throbbing with each beat of my terrified heart. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my shallow breathing and the occasional drip of water from unseen stalactites. Then I heard it. A low, guttural grunt echoed from outside the cave, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. The creature was still out there, searching for me. Each snort and growl sent fresh waves of terror coursing through my body. I pressed myself further into the cave wall, ignoring the sharp edges of rock digging into my back. My hand clamped over my mouth, stifling the whimper that threatened to escape. I couldn't risk making a sound, not with that thing so close. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me with each massive step. It was circling the cave entrance, methodically searching for any sign of its prey. Of me. "Please," I whispered, so quietly I could barely hear it myself. "Please, just go away." But it didn't go away. I could hear it moving back and forth, its breathing heavy and rhythmic. The sound of branches snapping and underbrush being crushed told me it was clearing the area around the cave entrance, removing any potential hiding spots. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, but what could I do? I was trapped, injured, with no weapon and no way to call for help. My only hope was to remain hidden, to pray that the creature would eventually give up and move on. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no way to truly measure time in the darkness of the cave. My leg had gone from throbbing pain to a dull, persistent ache. I knew I needed to examine the wound, to try and stop the bleeding, but I didn't dare move. Not while that thing was still out there. As the silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional grunt or snort from outside, I found my terror slowly being replaced by a gnawing curiosity. What was this creature? How could something like this exist without anyone knowing about it? And why was it so determined to hunt us down? Driven by a mix of fear and morbid fascination, I slowly, painfully inched my way toward the cave entrance. Every movement was agonizing, my injured leg protesting with each shift. But I had to see it. I had to know what we were up against. As I neared the mouth of the cave, I pressed myself flat against the ground, using the uneven terrain for cover. Squinting against the dim light filtering in from outside, I risked a glance into the clearing. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature was massive, far larger than I had initially thought. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't just its size that was terrifying. It was how it moved. Despite its bulk, it moved with an eerie grace, its movements precise and deliberate as it searched the area. Its face was the stuff of nightmares, a twisted amalgamation of ape and human features. Deep-set eyes glowed with an unsettling intelligence as it scanned its surroundings. Its nose flared repeatedly, and I realized with horror that it was trying to catch my scent. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as the creature methodically worked its way around the clearing. It overturned rocks, peered into bushes, and even climbed partway up trees to check for any sign of its prey. All the while, It let out low grunts and growls that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, its head snapped in my direction. I froze, not daring to breathe. Had it seen me? Could it smell the blood from my injured leg? The creature took a step toward the cave, then another. Its massive form blocked out what little light was filtering into the cave as it approached the entrance. I could see its nostrils flaring, its eyes narrowing as it peered into the darkness where I lay hidden. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. I closed my eyes, certain that at any moment I would feel its powerful hands grabbing me, pulling me out to meet the same fate as Chris. But the moment stretched on, and nothing happened. I cracked one eye open, then the other. The creature was still there, its massive form silhouetted in the cave entrance. But it wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, its eyes scanning the darkness of the cave. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We were locked in a silent standoff. Me, barely daring to breathe, praying to whatever might be listening that the darkness would conceal me. And the creature, so close I could smell its musky animal odor, searching for any sign of movement or life within the cave. Then, just as I thought my racing heart would betray me, the creature let out a frustrated roar that shook the very walls of the cave. It was a sound of pure rage and hunger, a primal scream that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. With one last piercing look into the cave, the creature turned and stalked away. Its heavy footsteps faded into the distance, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches and crushed vegetation. I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to believe it was gone. Minutes ticked by, then an hour. Slowly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. Birds chirping, small animals scurrying about. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, my body shaking uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I was alive, but for how long? The creature was still out there, and I was trapped in this cave, injured and alone. As the adrenaline subsided, the pain in my leg returned with a vengeance. I knew I needed to tend to the wound, to try and find a way out of this nightmare. But for now, all I could do was lie there shaking and sobbing quietly, praying that somehow, some way I would make it out of these woods alive. The creature was gone for now. But as the day wore on and shadows began to lengthen outside the cave, a new fear gripped me. What would happen when night fell again? Would the creature return, more determined than ever to find its prey? I knew I couldn't stay in this cave forever. Sooner or later I would have to venture out to try and find help or a way back to civilization. But the thought of leaving the relative safety of the cave filled me with dread. As I lay there trying to summon the courage to move, to plan, to do anything, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This nightmare was far from over. The cave's darkness had become suffocating. Despite the lingering fear, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. My injured leg throbbed relentlessly, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked in the forest. With trembling hands, I pushed myself up, wincing as pain shot through my body. "Come on, Natalie," I whispered to myself. "You can do this. You have to do this." Cautiously, I peered out of the cave entrance. The forest seemed eerily quiet, devoid of the usual chirping birds and rustling leaves. Every shadow looked like a potential threat. Every movement in my peripheral vision sent my heart racing, but there was no sign of the creature. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the cave. The sudden brightness made me squint, my eyes struggling to adjust after hours in the darkness. I leaned against a nearby tree, trying to get my bearings. Which way led back to civilization? In the chaos of the night before, I had lost all sense of direction. I chose a direction that seemed to slope downhill, figuring it might lead to a road or a river. Every step was agony, my injured leg protesting with each movement. I used fallen branches as makeshift crutches, anything to take the weight off my wounded limb. As I hobbled through the forest, my senses were on high alert. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me freeze, my eyes darting around frantically. Was it just a squirrel? Or was it the creature stalking me silently through the underbrush? Stay calm, I muttered to myself, trying to control my ragged breathing. One step at a time, just keep moving. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly. How far had we hiked before everything went to hell? It felt like days ago now, though I knew it had only been hours. My friends' faces flashed through my mind. Jake, Emily, Chris. Were they still out there somewhere, or had they met the same fate as... I shook my head, banishing the horrific images. I couldn't think about that now. I had to focus on survival. After what felt like hours of painful progress, I heard the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me as I quickened my pace, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. A stream meant the possibility of cleaning my wound, of finding a clear path, maybe even of following it to civilization. The small stream came into view, its clear water glistening in the dappled sunlight. I collapsed on its bank, relief washing over me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. Gingerly, I rolled up my torn pant leg to examine the wound. It was worse than I'd feared, a deep gash running along my calf, crusted with dried blood and forest debris. Infection was a real concern now. I dipped my hands into the cool stream, splashing water on my face before turning my attention to the wound. The cold water stung as I cleaned away the dirt and blood, but it felt good to finally tend to the injury. "Okay, Natalie," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet forest. "You can do this. Clean it, bandage it, and keep moving. You're going to make it out of here." As I tore a strip from my shirt to use as a makeshift bandage, a chill ran down my spine. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Slowly I raised my head, my hands frozen in the act of tying the bandage. That's when I saw it, a massive shadow looming over me, blocking out the sun. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There it stood, the creature that had haunted my nightmares towering above me. Its eyes glared down at me with a terrifying intelligence, a low growl rumbling from its chest. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I could see every detail of its face. The matted fur, the powerful jaw, the nostrils flaring as it caught my scent. This close, I could smell its musky odor, could see the muscles rippling beneath its thick hide. For a split second, I was paralyzed with fear. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, survival instinct kicked in. With a burst of adrenaline I didn't know I still possessed, I scrambled to my feet. I ran. Pain forgotten, injury ignored, I sprinted away from the stream. The creature's roar shook the very air around me, followed by the thunderous pounding of its footsteps. Trees blurred past as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. "Somebody help me!" I could hear the creature gaining on me, branches snapping and underbrush crushed beneath its massive feet. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. To stop was to die. In my panic, I barely registered the change in terrain. The ground began to slope upward, becoming rockier. I scrambled up the incline, using my hands to pull myself forward when my feet slipped on loose stones. The creature's growls were getting closer. I could almost feel its hot breath on my neck. Desperate, I glanced back, and immediately wished I hadn't. It was right behind me, one massive hand reaching out to grab me. That's when I saw it, a narrow crevice in the rock face just ahead. It was my only chance. With a final burst of speed, I lunged for the opening. I hit the ground hard, sliding into the crevice. It was a tight fit, rocks scraping against my skin as I wedged myself as far back as I could go. Not a moment too soon, the creature's roar of frustration echoed off the rocks as it reached the crevice, its massive hands scrabbling at the opening. I pressed myself against the back of the crevice, my whole body shaking. The creature's face appeared at the entrance, its eyes wild with rage. It roared again, the sound deafening in the confined space. But it couldn't reach me. The opening was too small for its massive bulk. For what felt like hours, it tried to get to me. Claws scraped against rock, teeth gnashed in frustration. I remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe, certain that at any moment it would find a way to reach me. Finally, with a last furious roar, the creature retreated. I heard its heavy footsteps moving away, felt the ground shake less and less until silence fell once again. Still, I didn't move. I couldn't be sure it was really gone, that this wasn't some trick to lure me out. So I stayed there, wedged in that narrow crevice, my body aching, my mind reeling from the near-death experience. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in my leg returned with a vengeance. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and still very much lost in these godforsaken woods. But I was alive. For now. As darkness began to fall, I knew I faced a difficult choice. Stay here, relatively safe but trapped? Or risk venturing out again, hoping to find my way to safety before the creature found me? Either way, I knew one thing for certain. This nightmare was far from over. The forest had become a labyrinth of terror, every shadow concealing potential danger. My legs burned with exhaustion, my injured calf screaming in protest with each step. But I couldn't stop, not with that thing out there, hunting me. As I stumbled through the darkening woods, a flicker of light caught my eye. At first I thought it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of my desperate mind. But as I squinted through the trees, my heart leaped. A cabin. Its windows glowed with warm light, a beacon of hope in this nightmare. Oh, thank God, I gasped, newfound energy surging through my battered body. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the searing pain that shot up my leg with each step. The cabin grew closer, its weathered wooden walls and slightly sagging porch the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. Just as I allowed myself to believe I might actually survive this ordeal, a bone-chilling roar shattered the night. I didn't need to look back to know the creature had found me again. Its thunderous footsteps shook the ground, growing louder by the second. No, 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 I whimpered, willing my exhausted body to move faster. 20 yards to the cabin. 15. 10. I could hear the creature's labored breathing now, feel the vibrations of its massive strides. 5 yards. The porch steps loomed before me. With a final desperate lunge, I threw myself at the cabin door. My fists pounded against the rough wood as I screamed, "Help! Please, somebody help me!" For a terrifying moment, there was no response. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, its hot breath on my neck. Then, miraculously, the door swung open. I didn't even see who opened it. I simply tumbled inside, my momentum carrying me across the threshold. "Close it!" I shrieked, scrambling to my feet. "Close the door!" A startled-looking man in his 60s slammed the door shut just as a massive impact shook the entire cabin. The creature had reached the porch, its furious roars making the windows rattle. "What in God's name?" the man started to say, but I cut him off. "Please," I gasped, my voice ragged with fear and exhaustion. "Is there a gun? Anything?" The man's eyes widened as he took in my battered appearance and the sounds of destruction coming from outside. Without a word, he hurried to a nearby cabinet and pulled out an old hunting rifle. "It won't stop," I warned him, my eyes fixed on the shuddering door. It's not normal." The pounding intensified. Wood splintered as the creature's massive fists hammered against the door. I could hear its grunts and snarls filled with primal rage and hunger. "What is it?" the man asked, his voice tight with fear as he loaded the rifle with shaking hands. I shook my head, unable to find the words to describe the horror that pursued me. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The doorframe cracked, long splinters of wood flying inward. Through the widening gaps, I caught glimpses of matted fur and glinting eyes filled with murderous intent. "Get back," the man ordered, raising the rifle. "If it gets in, run for the back door." I nodded, though I knew it was futile. If that thing got in, there would be no escape. The next impact nearly took the door off its hinges. The creature's massive hand reached through the gap, claws raking the air as it tried to force its way inside. The old man fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The creature roared in pain and fury, its hand withdrawing. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Had we actually heard it? That hope was short-lived. The pounding resumed with renewed vigor, the entire front wall of the cabin shaking under the onslaught. I could hear wood splintering, nails pulling free as the structure began to give way. "It's going to get in," I whispered, terror clawing at my throat. The old man's face was pale, his hands trembling as he reloaded the rifle. "What? What is that thing?" I opened my mouth to respond, though I had no idea what to say. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? But before I could speak, the pounding suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. We stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, straining our ears for any sound. Nothing. Seconds ticked by, stretching into minutes. Slowly, cautiously, I approached one of the windows, peering out into the darkness. The porch was empty, the surrounding forest still. I think it's gone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man lowered his rifle, his face etched with disbelief and lingering fear. What in heaven's name was that? I sank to the floor, the adrenaline draining from my system, leaving me shaky and exhausted. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I repeated, my voice cracking. As the tension slowly eased, the full weight of what I'd been through crashed over me. Tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was sobbing uncontrollably. The old man set aside his rifle and knelt beside me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's all right now," he said softly. "You're safe here." But even as he spoke those reassuring words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature was still out there somewhere in the dark forest, and somehow I knew it wasn't done with me yet. As dawn began to break, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, I steeled myself for what was to come. Somehow, I had to find a way out of these woods, back to civilization. And I had to do it before night fell again, because in the growing light, I could see the destruction the creature had wrought on the cabin's exterior. Deep claw marks scored the wood, the door hung crookedly on its hinges, and there, in the soft earth of the porch, was a single, massive footprint. Evidence of its existence. Evidence that would soon be gone, leaving me with nothing but my unbelievable story and the lingering terror of what I'd experienced. I looked at the old man, who was staring at the footprint with a mixture of awe and fear. "We need to call for help," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And then I need to tell you everything." My hands trembled as I dialed 911, the events of the past hours replaying in my mind like a nightmarish film reel. The old man from the cabin, Tom, hovered nearby, his weathered face etched with concern. As soon as the dispatcher answered, words tumbled out of me in a frantic rush. "Please, you have to help. There's something in the woods, a creature. It killed my friend and chased me. I barely escaped." The dispatcher's calm voice cut through my panic. "Ma'am, slow down. Are you safe now? Are you injured?" I took a shaky breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I'm at a cabin in the woods. I'm hurt, but I'm safe for now. But please, you need to send someone. There's a monster out there." "A monster?" The skepticism in her voice was palpable. "Can you describe what you saw?" How could I possibly describe the horror I'd witnessed? "It's huge, like a giant ape, but it walks on two legs. It's covered in fur, and its face is almost human, but not quite. Please, you have to believe me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When the dispatcher spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "We're sending officers to your location. Can you give me the address of the cabin?" Tom provided the address, and I relayed it to the dispatcher. As I hung up, I caught Tom's worried gaze. "They're coming," I said, my voice hoarse. But I don't think they believed me. Tom nodded grimly. Can't say I blame them. If I hadn't seen the evidence myself. He gestured to the damaged door and the deep claw marks scoring the wooden porch. The wait for the police felt interminable. Every rustle from the surrounding forest made me flinch, certain that the creature was returning to finish what it had started. When the sound of approaching vehicles finally broke the tense silence, relief washed over me like a physical force. 2 officers approached the cabin, their expressions a mix of concern and wariness. The older of the 2, a heavy-set man with graying hair, took the lead. "I'm Officer Daniels. This is Officer Rodriguez," he said, his eyes scanning the damaged porch. "We received a report of an attack?" I nodded eagerly, stepping forward. "Yes, that was me. Thank God you're here. There's a creature in these woods. It's incredibly dangerous. It killed my friend and—" Officer Daniels held up a hand, cutting me off. "Slow down, miss. Let's start from the beginning. What exactly did you see?" I took a deep breath and launched into my story, describing the camping trip, Chris's disappearance, and my terrifying encounters with the creature. As I spoke, I could see the officers exchanging skeptical glances. "And you're saying this creature is what caused these damages?" Officer Rodriguez asked, gesturing to the splintered door and claw marks. "Yes," I exclaimed. "Look at the size of those marks. What else could have done that?" Officer Daniels sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Miss, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but are you sure you're not exaggerating a bit? Maybe it was a bear?" Frustration and disbelief welled up inside me. "A bear? Are you kidding me? I know what I saw. This wasn't any normal animal. It was intelligent. It hunted us deliberately." Tom stepped forward, his voice gruff. "Officers, I didn't see the creature myself, but I heard it. Whatever was trying to break down my door wasn't any bear I've ever encountered." Officer Rodriguez nodded, but his expression remained doubtful. "We'll certainly look into it, sir, but without concrete evidence." "Evidence?" I almost shouted. "What about my injuries? What about Chris? He's still out there somewhere." Officer Daniels's voice took on a placating tone. "We'll absolutely search for your missing friend. But as for this Bigfoot creature, well, you have to understand how this sounds." I felt like I was going to be sick. They didn't believe me. How could they not believe me after everything I'd been through? "Please," I begged. "You have to send a search party into the woods. That thing is still out there. It's dangerous." The officers exchanged another look. "We'll conduct a thorough search of the area," Officer Rodriguez said. "But our primary concern right now is getting you medical attention. We have an ambulance on the way." As if on cue, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going began to fade, and the pain from my injuries came rushing back. But I couldn't give up. "You have to believe me," I pleaded. "People's lives are in danger." Officer Daniels placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We're taking your report seriously, miss, but we deal in facts, not cryptozoology. Let's get you to a hospital and we'll sort this all out." I watched helplessly as the officers stepped away to radio in their report. Their voices were low, but I caught phrases like possible bear attack and trauma-induced hallucination. Tears of frustration and fear welled in my eyes. Tom came to stand beside me, his weathered face full of sympathy. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I don't know what that thing was, but I know it wasn't natural. You're not crazy." His words were small comfort as I watched the officers return to their vehicle, clearly dismissing my account as some sort of hoax or delusion. As the ambulance pulled up, I felt a deep sense of defeat settling over me. They didn't believe me. The creature was still out there, and no one was going to do anything about it. As the paramedics helped me onto a stretcher, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. The last thing I saw as the ambulance doors closed was the dark line of trees surrounding Tom's cabin. Somewhere in those woods, the creature was waiting. And I was leaving with the terrible knowledge that no one was prepared for what might emerge from the forest depths. Sleep eluded me that night in Tom's cabin. Every creak of the settling wood, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, sent my heart racing. I lay on the old couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of memories and fears. "You should try to rest," Tom said softly, emerging from his bedroom. The concern in his eyes was genuine, a stark contrast to the skepticism I'd faced from the authorities. I shook my head, sitting up. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see it." My voice cracked. "Those eyes, that face. God, Tom, how can something like that exist?" He settled into an armchair across from me, his weathered face etched with sympathy. "I don't know, child. I've lived in these woods for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what you described. But I believe you. The way that thing was trying to break down my door." He shuddered. "That wasn't any animal I know." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the unexplainable hanging heavy in the air. As dawn began to creep through the windows, I made a decision. "I need to go back," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "To the campsite. I need to, I don't know, find something. Anything to prove I'm not crazy." Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. He nodded slowly. "I'll drive you. But we're not going far into those woods, you hear me?" The drive to the trailhead was tense. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hide a monstrous form. When we reached the parking area where this nightmare had begun just days ago, my friends' cars were gone. "They must have come back for them," I murmured, a pang of hurt and betrayal cutting through me. Had they even looked for me? Tom and I hiked the trail in silence. Despite the morning sunshine, the forest felt oppressive, heavy with secrets and hidden dangers. When we reached the clearing where our campsite had been, I stopped short, disbelief washing over me. This can't be right," I stammered. The clearing was empty. No tents, no scattered gear, no signs of the chaos and terror that had unfolded here. It was as if we'd never been there at all. "Maybe the rangers cleaned it up," Tom suggested, but his voice held doubt. I shook my head, moving further into the clearing. "No, look," I pointed to the ground. "There are no signs of a campsite ever being here. No flattened grass, no fire pit, nothing." As I searched the area, growing more frantic with each passing moment, I noticed yellow police tape snagged on a nearby bush. Hope flared in my chest. The police were here. They must have found something. But as I examined the area more closely, that hope quickly faded. The police presence seemed cursory at best. A few boot prints, some disturbed underbrush, but nothing that suggested a thorough investigation. "They didn't even look," I whispered, anger and despair warring within me. "They just wrote it off?" Tom placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "What about your friends? Any sign of them?" I shook my head, fighting back tears. "Nothing. It's like they vanished into thin air, along with any proof that thing was real." We spent another hour combing the area but found nothing. No massive footprints, no tufts of coarse fur, not even a broken branch that couldn't be explained by normal forest activity. It was as if the creature had been a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. The memory of its glowing eyes, filled with primal hunger and terrifying intelligence, was seared into my mind. The echo of its savage roar still made me tremble. These weren't the products of an overactive imagination or trauma-induced hallucination. They were real, visceral experiences that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As we made our way back to Tom's truck, the weight of what had happened, and the knowledge that no one would ever truly believe me, settled over me like a shroud. "What will you do now?" Tom asked as we drove away from the forest. I stared out the window, watching the trees thin out as we approached civilization. "I don't know," I admitted. "Go home, I guess. Try to move on somehow." But even as I said the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. How could I just go back to my normal life after what I'd experienced? How could I walk down a busy city street, knowing that out there in the dark places of the world, monsters like that creature existed? "You know," Tom said quietly, "some things in this world, They're beyond our understanding. Doesn't make them any less real? I nodded, grateful for his belief, even if it changed nothing. I wish I had some proof, something to show people that I'm not crazy, that what happened out there was real. Tom was silent for a long moment. Maybe it's better this way, he finally said. Think about it. If people knew for sure that something like that was out there, well, it'd change everything, wouldn't it? As much as I hated to admit it, he had a point. The world wasn't ready for the truth about what lurked in those woods. Hell, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. We reached Tom's cabin and he insisted on driving me all the way home. As I gathered my few belongings, my eyes fell on the deep claw marks scoring his front door. Soon, those would weather away, erasing the last physical evidence of my encounter. I don't think I'll ever go camping again, I said softly as we pulled away from the cabin. Just the thought of being in the woods. I don't think I could handle it. Tom nodded in understanding. Some experiences change us, deep down. There's no shame in that. As we drove towards the city, leaving the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this chapter of my life wasn't truly closed. The creature was still out there, somewhere in those dark woods. And even though I knew I'd never return, a part of me would always be there, forever running through those trees, pursued by a nightmare made flesh. The lights of the city appeared on the horizon, a welcome sight after the darkness of the forest. But as we drew closer to home, to the normal life I'd left behind just days ago, I realized that nothing would ever truly be the same. The world hadn't changed, but I had. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I navigated the winding dirt road, my old Subaru groaning with each bump and dip. The dense pine forest loomed on either side, creating a claustrophobic tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly. Just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing. There, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, stood my destination. A rustic log cabin that looked like it had been plucked straight from a postcard. I let out a sigh of relief as I pulled up to the cabin, killing the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Despite the warmth of the summer evening, a chill ran down my spine. I shook it off, chalking it up to the fatigue of the long drive from Seattle. Home sweet home, I muttered to myself, stepping out of the car and stretching my cramped muscles. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wild herbs, a welcome change from the city's pollution. I took a deep breath, trying to let the serenity of the place wash over me. This was supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my head and finally finish the novel I'd been struggling with for months. As I began unloading my belongings from the car, I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder at the wall of trees surrounding the clearing. It felt as if 1,000 hidden eyes were watching my every move. Get it together, Ethan, I chided myself. You're just not used to being alone out here. But even as I repeated those words like a mantra, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move in ways that didn't quite match the wind. I hurried to get everything inside, my imagination conjuring all sorts of ridiculous scenarios. The interior of the cabin was cozy, if a bit musty. A layer of dust covered every surface and cobwebs adorned the corners. I spent the next few hours cleaning and arranging my things, trying to make the place feel more like home. As I worked, I kept finding myself drawn to the windows, peering out into the deepening twilight. Night fell quickly in the forest. I heated up some canned soup for dinner, then settled into an old armchair with my laptop, determined to at least outline a new chapter. But the words wouldn't come. The silence outside was deafening, making every creak and groan of the cabin seem thunderous in comparison. I jumped at a particularly loud crack, my heart racing. Just the house settling, I muttered, but I couldn't help but picture massive fur-covered hands reaching for the walls, testing for weaknesses. Christ, Ethan, get a grip. I slammed my laptop shut and decided to turn in early. Maybe a good night's sleep would chase away these irrational fears. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to get comfortable on the lumpy mattress. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept jerking me back to wakefulness, just as I was about to drift off. An owl's hoot became a monstrous howl. The scratch of branches against the roof transformed into claws seeking entry. Finally, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I'm not sure how long I was out before something jolted me awake. My eyes flew open, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. For a moment I was disoriented, not recognizing my surroundings in the pitch darkness. Then I heard it again. A heavy, rhythmic thudding. Footsteps. And they were close, right outside my window. I lay frozen in terror, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps paused, and I heard a deep, rumbling sound that might have been breathing. Something scraped against the side of the cabin, and the whole structure seemed to shudder. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a low grunt that sounded far too inhuman to have come from a person. The footsteps resumed, circling the cabin. They paused again, this time near the front door. I heard wood creaking, as if under immense pressure. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, nearly knocking it to the floor in my panic. The screen's glow was blinding in the darkness. 2:17 a.m. No signal, of course. The noises outside continued for what felt like an eternity. Snuffling, grunting, the occasional thud against the walls. I cowered under my blankets like a child, my mind racing through all the possibilities. A bear? Some kind of escaped zoo animal? But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Whatever was out there was far larger, far more terrifying than any normal wildlife. Just as I was considering making a break for my car, the noises began to fade. The footsteps grew more distant, accompanied by the snapping of branches. Then, silence fell once again. I didn't move for a long time, straining my ears for any sign that the creature might return. Eventually, my exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted into a restless sleep, filled with dreams of massive, shadowy figures and glowing eyes in the darkness. I awoke with a start as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's dusty windows. For a moment, I was disoriented, the events of the night feeling like a distant nightmare. But as I stumbled out of bed, the memory came rushing back with crystal clarity. I approached the window, cautiously, half expecting to see some monstrous face peering in at me. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the peaceful forest bathed in the soft glow of dawn. It was just a dream, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Or maybe some animal wandering around. Nothing to worry about. But as I went through my morning routine, I couldn't shake the lingering dread that clung to me like a second skin. I kept replaying the sounds I'd heard, the feeling of being watched. It had all seemed so real. I stepped outside, steeling myself for... what? Massive footprints? Claw marks on the walls? But there was nothing. No signs of disturbance. No evidence that anything unusual had happened during the night. "See?" I told myself. "Your imagination just ran wild in an unfamiliar place. It happens to everyone." As the day brightened, I felt my fears begin to dissipate. I was being ridiculous, letting my writer's imagination get the better of me. I'd come out here for peace and solitude, and I was determined to enjoy it. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the forest come to life around me. Birds chirped, squirrels chattered, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was beautiful, serene. Nothing like the menacing presence I'd imagined in the dark. "Today's a new day," I said, raising my mug in a toast to the wilderness. "Time to get some real writing done." As I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, a branch swayed oddly, as if something large had just pushed past it. I squinted, trying to see deeper into the shadowy undergrowth. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flash of movement, something massive and dark, slipping between the trees with surprising grace for its size. I blinked and it was gone. Just another trick of the light, I told myself. Just my overactive imagination, still working overtime after a restless night. But as I stepped back into the cabin, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that my ordeal was far from over. That last night had been just the beginning of something far more terrifying than I could possibly imagine. After that unsettling first night, I was determined to shake off my paranoia and explore the beautiful wilderness surrounding the cabin. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit, then set off down one of the hiking trails I'd spotted on my drive-in. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. For a while, I felt myself relaxing, enjoying the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The fresh air and exercise were exactly what I needed to clear my head. About 2 hours into my hike, the trail opened up into a small clearing. I stopped short, my breath catching in my throat. The peaceful scene I'd been enjoying was shattered by the sight before me. The clearing looked like a war zone. Trees were bent at unnatural angles, some snapped completely in half. Deep gouges marred the trunks of those still standing, as if something with massive claws had used them as scratching posts. The undergrowth was trampled flat, and in the center of the destruction lay the carcass of a deer, half-eaten and already buzzing with flies. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a hesitant step forward. My mind raced through possibilities. A freak windstorm, maybe? But that wouldn't explain the claw marks, or the deer. A bear? But I'd never heard of a bear causing this level of destruction. As I examined the scene more closely, a chill ran down my spine. Some of the broken trees were thick. It would take immense strength to snap them like twigs. And the claw marks, they were far too high up to have been made by any normal animal. I backed away slowly, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. I turned and hurried back down the trail, my earlier peace shattered by a growing sense of dread. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. I was sweaty, tired, and on edge. All I wanted was a shower and a cold drink from the cooler I'd left on the porch. As I approached the cabin, something caught my eye. There, in a patch of soft mud near the porch steps, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, and distinctly humanoid in shape. "No," I whispered, crouching down to examine it more closely. "That's impossible." But there it was, clear as day. A massive, bare footprint with 5 distinct toes. I looked around frantically, spotting several more leading away from the cabin and into the dense underbrush. My mind reeled. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot wasn't real. It was just a myth, a legend. But as I stared at those footprints, I couldn't deny the evidence in front of me. I practically ran into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was an elaborate prank? But who would go to such lengths out here in the middle of nowhere? As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound. The creaking of the cabin, the rustle of leaves outside. Everything seemed sinister now. I tried to distract myself by working on my novel, but the words wouldn't come. My thoughts kept drifting back to that destroyed clearing, to those impossible footprints. Around midnight, I decided I needed some air. Maybe the cool night breeze would help clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line nervously. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They were huge and far too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror, and whatever that thing was, watching me from the darkness. Then it blinked, and a low, rumbling growl reached my ears. I stumbled backward, fumbling with the door handle. By the time I got the door open and looked back, the eyes were gone. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. "This isn't happening," I said aloud, trying to steady my breathing. "This can't be happening." But it was happening, and things were about to get worse. Around 2 a.m., a sound jolted me from my fitful sleep. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising into a bone-chilling howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something horrifyingly in between. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. The howl went on, filled with a primal rage that made my blood run cold. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat huddled in a corner, flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, desperately wishing for a signal. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. What I saw made my stomach drop. The trash cans I'd left by the side of the cabin were overturned, their contents strewn across the yard. Worse, the heavy-duty cooler I'd left on the porch was in pieces, as if something had smashed it open like a piñata. All the food inside was gone. With shaking hands, I opened the door and stepped outside. The destruction was even worse up close. Deep scratches marred the wood of the porch where the cooler had been. Whatever had done this possessed incredible strength. As I surveyed the damage, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. A flash of dark fur, the suggestion of an enormous, hulking shape. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows with surprising speed for something so large. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. This was no bear, no known predator. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As the full impact of my situation hit me, I realized with growing horror that I was trapped here. My car was nearly out of gas. I'd planned to drive to the nearest town for supplies later today. The cabin had no landline, and my cell phone was useless out here. I was alone in the woods, and something was out there. Something big, something dangerous, and it knew exactly where I was. With trembling hands, I began to gather up the scattered trash, my eyes constantly darting to the tree line. I had to figure out a plan. I had to find a way to survive until I could get out of here. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. I was no longer the hunter in these woods. The events of the previous day and night had left me shaken to my core. I'd barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. As morning light filtered through the windows, I knew I needed to pull myself together. I couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by fear. I had to be practical to prepare. The nights were getting colder and I realized I'd need firewood. The thought of venturing outside made my stomach churn, but I couldn't risk freezing if the power went out. Steeling my nerves, I grabbed an axe from the tool shed and headed towards a fallen tree I'd spotted near the edge of the clearing. As I worked, methodically chopping and stacking wood, I tried to convince myself that the events of the past 24 hours had just been a product of an overactive imagination. The isolation, the unfamiliar surroundings, it was all just getting to me. I almost had myself believing it too. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a massive shadow moved between the trees. It was there and gone in an instant, too quick for me to get a clear look. But the sheer size of it, nothing that big should be able to move so fast. I froze, the axe hanging limply at my side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. Not even the usual chorus of birds and insects. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then the smell hit me. It was overpowering, a mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something musky and wild. My stomach heaved, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. That's when I heard it. Heavy, labored breathing, just beyond the tree line. Whatever it was close. Too close. "Okay, Ethan," I whispered to myself. "Just back away slowly. No sudden movements." I began to edge backwards, my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen the shadow. The breathing grew louder, more agitated. I could hear twigs snapping under immense weight, leaves rustling as something massive shifted its position. Suddenly, a deer burst from the underbrush about 20 yards to my left. It was a beautiful animal, but its eyes were wide with terror. It hadn't even registered my presence. All of its attention was focused on something behind it. For a split second, I locked eyes with the deer. In that moment, I saw a reflection of my own fear, a primal understanding passing between us. We were both prey here. Then it happened. A huge, hairy arm, easily as thick as my torso, shot out from the bushes. I caught a glimpse of massive, curved claws before they sank into the deer's flank. The poor animal didn't even have time to cry out before it was yanked back into the underbrush with terrifying speed and strength. I stood there, paralyzed, as the sounds of rending flesh and snapping bones filled the air. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the clearing, setting every hair on my body on end. That's what finally broke me out of my stupor. Dropping the axe, I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as I sprinted towards the cabin. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of pursuit, thunderous footsteps, branches snapping like twigs under enormous weight. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," I panted as I ran, too terrified to even look back. The footsteps were getting closer. Whatever this thing was, it was fast. Inhumanly fast. I could see the cabin now, its weathered wood my only hope for safety. Just a few more yards. Something whooshed past my head, a branch, I realized, thrown with incredible force. If it had connected, it would have taken my head clean off. With a final burst of speed, I reached the porch. I fumbled with the door handle, my sweaty hands slipping on the metal. Come on," I pleaded. The door finally swung open. I dove inside, slamming it shut behind me just as something massive collided with the other side. The entire cabin shook with the impact. Then came the roar. It was deafening, a sound of pure, primal rage that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. The windows rattled, dust rained down from the rafters, and I swear I could feel the floorboards vibrating beneath my feet. I scrambled away from the door, expecting it to splinter inward at any moment. But it held. The roar faded, replaced by heavy, snuffling breaths. I could hear whatever it was circling the cabin, testing the walls, the windows. "This isn't real," I whispered, pressing my back against the far wall. "This can't be real." But I knew it was. I'd seen it, or at least part of it. That impossible arm, the strength it had displayed in snatching that deer. This was no bear, no known predator. This was something else entirely. Hours passed. I didn't move from my spot against the wall, too terrified to even approach the windows. The creature outside continued its patrol, occasionally punctuating the silence with low growls or the sound of claws scraping against wood. As night fell, a new fear gripped me. What if it figured out how to get in? The cabin suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary, but I knew I stood no chance if I tried to make a run for it. My only hope was to wait it out, to pray that it would eventually lose interest and move on. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the monster outside, a chilling realization settled over me. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching me. It had waited until I was vulnerable, until I was far from the safety of the cabin. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This was something intelligent, something cunning, and it wanted me. As if in response to my thoughts, another earth-shattering roar split the night. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. When I opened them again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, seeping in under the door, were a few coarse, dark hairs, each one easily as thick as my finger. I knew then that this was far from over. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't going to give up easily, and I was trapped here, alone, with no way to call for help. As the night wore on, I found myself wondering, would I survive to see the morning? And if I did, What fresh horrors would the new day bring? The night stretched on endlessly, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. I remained huddled in the corner of the cabin, too terrified to move, my eyes fixed on the door. The creature outside had gone quiet, but I knew better than to think it had left. No, it was out there waiting, watching. Just as exhaustion began to overtake my fear, a thunderous crash jolted me back to full alertness. The entire cabin shook, windows rattling in their frames as something enormous slammed against the walls. I bit back a scream, pressing myself further into the corner. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." Another crash answered me, this one even more powerful than the first. I could hear wood splintering, the old cabin groaning under the assault. How long could it hold out against this kind of force? I scrambled to my feet, looking frantically for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I snatched it up, the cold iron providing little comfort against the terror that gripped me. A new sound caught my attention, a scraping, scratching noise coming from one of the windows. Slowly I turned to look, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. Massive fingers, each as thick as my wrist and tipped with wicked claws, were curling around the windowsill. The wood creaked and bent under their grip as the creature tried to pry the window open. "Oh God," I whispered, watching in horror as the window frame began to splinter. The glass rattled, hairline cracks spreading across its surface like a spiderweb. I raised the fireplace poker, knowing full well how pitiful a defense it would be if that thing got inside. But I wasn't going down without a fight. Just as I thought the window would give way, the fingers withdrew. For a moment, all was quiet. Then a face pressed against the glass, or at least, what I assumed was a face. In the darkness, all I could make out were two glowing eyes set deep in a mass of matted fur, and a mouthful of yellowed teeth bared in a silent snarl. Our gazes locked, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this creature was intelligent. Those eyes held more than just animal hunger. There was calculation there, and a malevolence that chilled me to my core. The face disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, followed by another bone-jarring impact against the cabin wall. The lights flickered ominously. "No, no, no," I muttered, glancing at the old electric lamps. If the power went out? As if summoned by my fear, darkness suddenly engulfed me. The cabin's old wiring had finally given out under the stress of the attack. I was plunged into a blackness so complete it felt suffocating. The sounds intensified in the darkness. Splintering wood, inhuman grunts and growls, the creaking of the cabin as it struggled to withstand the assault. I stumbled blindly, my hands outstretched, trying to find my way to the kitchen where I'd left my flashlight. Something warm and wet dripped onto my face as I moved. I reached up, my fingers coming away sticky. The roof was leaking. No, not leaking. The creature was tearing it apart. Panic overtook me. I had to call for help. Someone had to know I was out here, had to come and save me from this nightmare. I fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it in my haste to dial 911. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. I was miles from the nearest cell tower, trapped in a dead zone with a monster trying to rip its way inside. I sank to the floor, clutching the useless phone to my chest. This was it. This was how I was going to die. Torn apart by something that shouldn't even exist, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. No one would ever know what happened to me. The attack continued throughout the night, a relentless barrage that left me huddled on the floor, covering my ears and praying for it to end. At some point, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion and terror. When I opened my eyes again, pale morning light was filtering through the shattered windows. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture overturned, walls dented and scarred, chunks of the roof missing. But it was quiet. Eerily quiet. I stayed where I was for a long time, listening intently for any sign that the creature was still out there. But all I could hear was the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze and the tentative songs of returning birds. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. Every muscle in my body ached from the long night spent, tensed and ready for the worst. I made my way to one of the broken windows, peering cautiously outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light. There was no sign of the monster that had besieged me through the night. No footprints, no fur caught on broken branches, nothing to prove that the terrifying ordeal had been anything more than a nightmare. But I knew better. The destroyed cabin was evidence enough of what had happened here. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my gut like a lead weight, that it wasn't over. The creature was out there somewhere in those woods, waiting, planning. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, to find help, to warn someone about what was lurking in these forests. But first I needed to make sure it was really gone, at least for now. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle. It was time to venture outside and face whatever daylight might bring. But even as I steeled myself to step out of the relative safety of the battered cabin, a part of me wondered, was I walking into an even greater danger? My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to stay inside. But I had to know what I was dealing with. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the harsh morning light. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The cabin looked like it had been through a war. Deep claw marks gouged the walls, some of them easily 8 feet off the ground. The porch railing was splintered and one of the support beams had been nearly torn from its moorings. But it was the footprints that truly drove home the horror of what I'd faced. They were everywhere, pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin. Each one was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 distinct toes. They were unmistakably hominid in shape, yet no human could have left prints like these. "This isn't possible," I muttered, crouching down to examine one of the clearer impressions. The soil was still damp, the edges of the print crisp. Whatever had made these, it had been here recently. Very recently. I stood up, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed peaceful in the morning light, but I knew better now. There was something out there, something that defied explanation. Swallowing hard, I stepped off the porch to get a better look at the damage to the cabin's exterior. That's when I saw it. A tuft of coarse dark hair caught on a splintered board. With shaking hands, I reached out to touch it. The hair was thick, almost wire-like in texture. It wasn't bear fur or any other animal I was familiar with. This was something else entirely. Suddenly, a blood-curdling roar shattered the morning stillness. It was close, far too close, and filled with a primal rage that sent ice through my veins. I didn't think. I ran. My feet pounded up the porch steps as another roar split the air, this one even closer. I slammed the cabin door shut behind me, fumbling with the lock as the ground began to shake with heavy, rapid footfalls. Oh God, I panted, backing away from the door. My eyes darted to the window, and that's when I saw it. A massive shape burst from the tree line, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large. In the clear light of day, I finally got a good look at the creature that had terrorized me. It was vaguely human-shaped, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted brown fur. Muscles rippled beneath that fur as it moved, speaking to the incredible strength I'd witnessed the night before. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. A heavy brow ridge, a flat nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth currently bared in a snarl. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They were unmistakably intelligent, filled with a malevolence that chilled me to my core. Our gazes locked for a split second, and I saw recognition there. It knew me. It had been hunting me specifically. The creature let out another ear-splitting roar and charged straight for the cabin. I scrambled backwards, tripping over an overturned chair and falling hard on my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me, leaving me gasping as the monster reached the porch. The entire cabin shook as it slammed into the door. Wood splintered, and I could see the frame starting to give way. In a panic, I crawled backwards, my eyes fixed on the door as it bulged inward with each impact. A massive, hairy arm punched through the weakened wood, clawed fingers grasping blindly. I let out a strangled cry, finally managing to get to my feet. I needed somewhere to hide, somewhere more secure. The bathroom. It was small, with no windows, and the door was solid. It was my only chance. I sprinted down the short hallway, the sounds of destruction growing louder behind me. Just as I reached the bathroom door, I heard a final, thunderous crash. The cabin's main door had given way. Heavy footsteps shook the floor as I slammed the bathroom door shut, twisting the lock with trembling fingers. I pressed my back against the door, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor. The creature's grunts and snuffles were clearer now, no longer muffled by walls and distance. I could hear it moving through the cabin, tearing things apart as it searched for me. Minutes stretched into hours as I huddled there, barely daring to breathe. The sounds of destruction were constant, ripping fabric, splintering wood, shattering glass. Occasionally, the monster would let out a roar of frustration that made the very walls vibrate. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind racing through possible escape scenarios, each one more unlikely than the last. My legs had long since gone numb, and my throat was parched from fear and dehydration. As the light coming through the small gap under the door began to fade, signaling the approach of evening, a new sound caught my attention. The creature's movements had changed. They were more methodical. It was no longer just blindly destroying things. It was systematically checking every possible hiding place. My heart nearly stopped as I realized what that meant. It was only a matter of time before it reached the bathroom. As if on cue, the footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the door as if I could somehow meld with the wood. The doorknob rattled. A low, rumbling growl came from just inches away, and I knew the creature was right on the other side of the door. I could smell its wild, musky odor seeping through the cracks. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, something scraped against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. This was a message. It knew exactly where I was, and it was letting me know that it could get to me whenever it wanted. As I sat there paralyzed with terror, a chilling thought wormed its way into my mind. The sun was setting. Night was falling. The bathroom had become my prison, a flimsy sanctuary against the horror that lurked just beyond the door. As night fell, the sounds of destruction had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more terrifying. I knew it was out there, waiting, its patience far outlasting my own. Hours passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I must have dozed off at some point, my body finally giving in to the fatigue that had been building for days. It was a mistake I would soon regret. A deafening crack jolted me awake. For a moment I was disoriented, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Then I saw it, a massive fist punching through the splintering wood of the bathroom door. No, 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 I whimpered, scrambling backwards until I hit the far wall. Another punch, and the door gave way entirely. There, filling the doorframe, stood the creature I now knew could only be Bigfoot. In the confined space of the bathroom, it seemed even larger, its hulking form blocking out what little light remained in the cabin. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw nothing human in its gaze. There was only primal rage, a hunger that went beyond mere animal instinct. This thing wanted me dead, and it had the means to make that happen. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Terror had robbed me of my voice. The creature moved with shocking speed for something so large. Before I could react, its massive hand shot out, wrapping around my ankle with crushing force. Pain exploded through my leg as it yanked, effortlessly dragging me across the bathroom floor. "Let go!" I finally managed to yell, my voice shrill with panic. My fingers scrabbled desperately for purchase on the smooth tile, leaving bloody streaks as my nails tore. But it was useless. The beast's strength was inhuman. It dragged me out of the bathroom and into what remained of the cabin's main room, tossing aside debris with its free hand as if it weighed nothing. I twisted, trying to kick free with my other leg, but it was like striking a brick wall. The creature didn't even seem to notice my efforts. Suddenly, I was airborne. The monster had lifted me by my ankle, dangling me upside down as easily as a child might hold a doll. Blood rushed to my head, making me dizzy, but even through the haze I could see those terrible eyes fixed on me. Its face was inches from mine now. Hot, rancid breath washed over me, carrying the stench of rotting meat. I gagged, my stomach heaving, but there was nothing left to bring up after days of terror and little food. "Please," I gasped, though I knew it was futile. This thing, this Bigfoot, wasn't here to negotiate. It wanted blood, my blood, and nothing I said was going to change that. For a long moment, it just stared at me, as if contemplating how best to end my life. Then, without warning, it moved. The world spun as the creature flung me across the room. I had a split second to see the approaching wall before pain exploded through my body. But I didn't stop there. The impact carried me through the remains of a shattered window. I hit the ground outside hard, the breath driven from my lungs. Sharp pain lanced through my side, and I realized dimly that I must have broken some ribs. Warm wetness spread across my shirt, blood from dozens of cuts left by the broken glass. Dazed and half-conscious, I could only watch through blurry vision as the monster emerged from the ruined cabin. It stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the dim light from inside, its massive chest heaving with exertion or excitement. I couldn't tell which. Then it turned back to the cabin and began to systematically destroy everything in sight. It overturned furniture, smashed through walls, and tore apart anything it could get its hands on. The violence of it was terrifying, but there was also a strange purposefulness to its actions. This wasn't just blind rage. It was looking for something. I tried to move, to crawl away while it was distracted, but my body wouldn't respond. The pain was overwhelming, and darkness was creeping in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness claimed me was the creature emerging from the cabin once more. It paused, its head swiveling in my direction. Even in my addled state, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of intelligence in those inhuman eyes, a cold calculation that chilled me to my core. Then the darkness took me, and I knew no more. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to lighten the sky. Every breath sent waves of agony through my battered body, but the pain helped clear my head. Slowly, painfully, I managed to lift my head and look around. The clearing was empty. There was no sign of the creature, no indication that it had ever been there at all, save for the utter destruction of the cabin. I knew I had to move. If the monster came back, I'd be helpless. With a groan of pain, I rolled onto my stomach and began to crawl towards the tree line. My car was there, just beyond the first row of pines. If I could reach it, I might have a chance. Each movement was agony, but fear drove me on. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind me, to feel those massive hands grabbing me once more, but there was nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing and the early morning calls of waking birds. After what felt like hours, my hand touched cool metal. I'd made it to the car. With trembling fingers, I fumbled for the door handle, praying that I'd left it unlocked. The door swung open, and I nearly wept with relief. Using the last of my strength, I pulled myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The keys were still in the ignition. I'd never been so grateful for my own carelessness. As I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, a massive shape melted back into the shadows of the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw those terrifyingly intelligent eyes watching me. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the damp earth as I backed out of the clearing. As I sped down the winding dirt road, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that nightmarish place, one thought kept running through my mind. Would anyone believe me? And even if they did, what could anyone do against a monster like that? Every inch of my body screamed in protest as I dragged myself through the dense underbrush. The adrenaline that had fueled my initial escape was long gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and searing pain. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it find me again. My mind kept replaying the horrific events at the cabin, the splintering door, those inhuman eyes, the bone-crushing strength as it flung me like a rag doll. I shuddered, biting back a whimper as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through my battered ribs. "Keep moving," I muttered to myself, my voice barely more than a rasp. "Just keep moving." I had no idea how long I'd been crawling through the forest. Hours, maybe. The thick canopy above made it impossible to gauge the sun's position. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. A sharp crack echoed through the trees behind me, like a large branch snapping under immense weight. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. Another crack, closer this time, and then another. It was coming. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I had left. I scrambled forward, no longer caring about stealth. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my already shredded clothing, but I barely felt it. All that mattered was escape. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, more frenzied. I could hear its labored breathing now, punctuated by low, guttural grunts that sent ice through my veins. It was gaining on me. Just as I was sure I felt hot breath on the back of my neck, the ground disappeared beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, unable to stifle a cry of pain as I bounced off rocks and exposed roots. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and gasping for air. The shock of icy water brought me back to my senses. I had landed in a shallow stream, the current tugging gently at my battered body. For a moment I just lay there, letting the cold numb some of the pain. Then I remembered why I was running. I pushed myself up, scanning the top of the embankment. There was no sign of the creature, but I knew it had to be close. Then a thought struck me. The water, it might mask my scent. Without hesitation, I plunged deeper into the stream. The shock of the cold made me gasp, but I forced myself to keep moving. I followed the current, stumbling over slippery rocks and fighting against the pull of the water. I don't know how long I stayed in that stream. My limbs grew numb, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. But the fear of what lurked in the forest kept me going long past the point where I should have collapsed. As the light began to fade from the sky, I finally allowed myself to leave the relative safety of the water. My waterlogged clothes clung to me, making every movement a struggle. I needed to find shelter for the night. That's when I spotted it. A massive fallen tree, its roots creating a small hollow beneath the upturned earth. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I crawled into the cramped space, curling into a tight ball to conserve what little body heat I had left. As full darkness fell, the forest came alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But beneath it all, I strained to hear any sign of my pursuer. Hours passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see those glowing eyes peering into my hiding spot, to feel those massive hands reaching for me once again. But nothing came. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I allowed myself to hope. Had I actually managed to lose it? Was this nightmare finally over? Slowly, painfully, I extracted myself from the hollow. My entire body felt like one giant bruise, and I was pretty sure at least a couple of my ribs were broken. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. That's when I heard it. A faint rhythmic rumbling in the distance. Traffic. A road. Civilization. Hope surged through me, giving me strength I didn't know I had left. I started limping towards the sound, using trees for support when my legs threatened to give out. "Almost there," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You're almost there, Ethan. Just a little farther." The sound grew louder with each painstaking step. I could almost taste freedom, could almost believe that this ordeal was nearly over. Then a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, just visible through the early morning mist, stood a massive, shadowy figure. It was too far away to make out details, but I didn't need to see them. I knew exactly what it was. Our eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, I saw something in its gaze that chilled me to my core. It wasn't just rage or animal hunger. There was recognition, intelligence. This thing knew me now, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I turned and ran. Pain forgotten, exhaustion pushed aside by a fresh surge of adrenaline. I sprinted towards the sound of traffic. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sounds of pursuit filled the air behind me. Heavy footfalls, snapping branches, that terrible guttural breathing. It was gaining on me. Fast. Just when I was sure I felt claws grazing the back of my neck, the trees thinned. Suddenly, I burst out of the forest and onto the shoulder of a highway. A truck horn blared as the driver swerved to avoid me. I spun around, expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the peaceful forest, bathed in early morning light. Had I imagined it? Was my mind finally cracking under the strain of what I'd been through? As I stood there, swaying on my feet, a car pulled over. An older man rolled down his window, his eyes wide with concern. "Jesus, son," he said. "What happened to you? Do you need help?" I opened my mouth to explain, to warn him about the monster in the woods. But as I looked at his kind, worried face, I realized how insane it would all sound. Who would believe me? So instead, I simply nodded, fighting back tears of relief. "Yes," I croaked. "Please, I need help." As the man helped me into his car, I couldn't stop myself from taking one last look at the forest. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of intelligent, inhuman eyes watching me from the shadows. Then we were pulling away, leaving the nightmare behind. But even as the trees receded in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somehow, some way, our paths would cross again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room were harsh after days in the dim forest. I squinted, trying to focus on the doctor examining my injuries. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving me in a haze of pain and exhaustion. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor said, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Can you tell me again exactly what happened?" I took a deep breath, wincing as my broken ribs protested. "I've already told you. It was Bigfoot. A massive, hair-covered creature attacked me in my cabin and chased me through the woods." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, who raised an eyebrow. I'd seen that look too many times already. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor said carefully, "you've sustained some serious injuries. A concussion, 3 broken ribs, multiple lacerations, and severe dehydration. It's possible that in your confused state—" "I'm not confused," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or whatever else you're thinking. It was Bigfoot." The doctor sighed, making a note on her clipboard. "I'm going to recommend a psychological evaluation once we've treated your physical injuries. You've been through a traumatic experience, and it's important we address any potential issues that may have arisen." I opened my mouth to argue, but the fight suddenly left me. What was the point? They'd already made up their minds. A few hours later, a police officer arrived to take my statement. He was a burly man with a bushy mustache and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "All right, Mr. Thompson," he said, flipping open his notebook. "Why don't you tell me what happened out there?" Once again, I recounted my harrowing tale. The attack on the cabin, the chase through the woods, the terrifying strength of the creature. With each word, I could see the officer's expression growing more and more doubtful. When I finished, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, I've been patrolling these woods for 20 years. We've had bear attacks, sure, maybe even the occasional mountain lion. But Bigfoot?" He shook his head. I think maybe you got spooked by a bear, and your imagination ran wild." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, frustration building. "I know the difference between a bear and whatever that thing was." The officer patted my shoulder gently. "Look, son, you've been through a lot. Why don't we just say it was a bear attack for the report? It'll be easier for everyone that way." I slumped back against the pillows, too tired to argue anymore. "Fine," I muttered. "Whatever you say." The next day, my friends Mark and Sarah came to visit. Their initial concern quickly turned to awkward discomfort as I recounted what had really happened. "Ethan," Sarah said gently, "are you sure you're not, I don't know, misremembering things? It sounds like you hit your head pretty hard." "I'm not misremembering anything," I snapped. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why doesn't anyone believe me?" Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's just Bigfoot, man. That's a pretty big leap. Maybe it was just a really big bear?" I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted. "It wasn't a bear," I said quietly. "But I can see you don't believe me either." The awkward silence that followed was eventually broken by a nurse coming in to check my vitals. My friends left soon after, promising to come back when I was feeling better. As the days passed, I became obsessed with finding some shred of evidence to support my story. I scoured news websites and social media, searching for any reports of unusual activity in the area. But there was nothing. Not a single mention of strange sightings or unexplained phenomena. It was as if the creature had simply vanished, leaving no trace of its existence beyond the injuries it had inflicted on me. On the 4th day of my hospital stay, my phone rang. It was the owner of the cabin, and he was furious. "What the hell did you do to my property?" he demanded without preamble. "I didn't," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't give me that bullshit. The place is trashed, walls smashed, furniture destroyed. It looks like a goddamn war zone in there." My heart raced. This was it. Proof that something had happened. "That's because it was attacked," I said eagerly. "By a..." "Save it," the man growled. "I talked to the cops. They said you claimed it was some kind of Bigfoot attack. Are you kidding me with this crap?" "It's the truth," I insisted. "I swear I didn't. I don't want to hear it. You went on some drunken rampage and destroyed my cabin. I'm sending you the bill for repairs, and if you don't pay up, I'll see your ass in court." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone in disbelief. How could this be happening? The cabin's destruction was proof that something had occurred, something beyond my control. But instead of validating my story, it was being used against me. As I lay there, surrounded by the sterile whiteness of the hospital room, a crushing sense of isolation settled over me. No one believed me. Not the doctors, not the police, not even my friends. To them, I was either lying or delusional. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt its breath on my skin, experienced its terrifying strength firsthand. That creature was real, and it was still out there. A chill ran down my spine as a new thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't done with me? What if, even now, it was watching, waiting for another opportunity? I shook my head, trying to dispel the paranoid thoughts. No, that was ridiculous. I was safe here, surrounded by people. The creature wouldn't dare come this close to civilization. Would it? As night fell and the hospital quieted, I found myself staring out the window at the distant tree line. The forest looked peaceful in the moonlight, but I knew better now. I knew what secrets those trees could hide. I turned away from the window, pulling the thin hospital blanket tighter around me. I was safe here, I told myself. The nightmare was over. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, a part of me knew better. Something told me that my encounter with the impossible was far from over. That somehow, some way, our paths would cross again. And next time, I would be ready. Next time, I would make them believe. The drive back to the cabin felt like a descent into madness. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to forget this foolish quest for proof. But I couldn't. I had to know, had to find something, anything to validate my experience. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a suffocating tunnel of green. I half expected to see a massive fur-covered shape burst from the underbrush at any moment. As I approached the turnoff to the cabin, my heart began to race. Memories of that terrible night flooded back, the splintering door, those inhuman eyes, the bone-crushing strength as it flung me like a rag doll. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "You can do this, Ethan," I muttered to myself. "You need answers." I pulled into the clearing, my mouth going dry at the sight before me. The cabin stood there, looking exactly as it had when I first arrived. No broken windows, no splintered wood, no sign of the destruction I'd witnessed. "No," I whispered, stumbling out of the car. "This isn't possible." I approached the cabin cautiously, my camera clutched tightly in my trembling hands. The porch creaked beneath my weight, but it was sturdy, not at all like the wreckage I remembered. With shaking fingers, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was immaculate. No overturned furniture, no claw marks on the walls. Even the bathroom door, which I distinctly remembered being torn to splinters, was intact. "What the hell is going on?" I said aloud, my voice echoing in the empty space. I moved through the cabin in a daze, snapping pictures of the unmarred walls, the unbroken windows. Part of me wanted to believe this was good news. Maybe it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. I had the scars to prove it hadn't been a dream. Determined to find something, anything to corroborate my story, I ventured into the surrounding woods. I retraced the path of my desperate escape, searching for broken branches, unusual tracks, anything out of the ordinary. Hours passed as I combed through the underbrush. My clothes were soon damp with sweat, my arms scratched and bleeding from pushing through thorny bushes. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need for validation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I had to face a harsh reality. I had found nothing. No footprints, no tufts of fur, not a single shred of evidence to suggest that a massive, unknown creature had ever been here. I sank to my knees in a small clearing, exhaustion and despair washing over me. "It was real," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I know it was real. Why isn't there any proof?" The forest offered no answers, only the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. As darkness began to fall, a primal fear gripped me. I couldn't be out here at night. Not again. I scrambled to my feet, suddenly very aware of how far I'd wandered from the cabin. Every shadow seemed to move, every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. I ran, no longer caring about finding evidence, focused solely on reaching the safety of my car. By the time I burst out of the tree line and into the cabin's clearing, I was gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I fumbled with my keys, glancing nervously over my shoulder as I unlocked the car door. As I slid into the driver's seat, a movement at the edge of the forest caught my eye. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a massive, dark shape melt back into the shadows. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I didn't wait to see if it would reappear. I started the engine and peeled out of the clearing, gravel spraying behind me as I sped down the dirt road. The long drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions. Relief at escaping the forest warred with crushing disappointment at my failure to find proof. And beneath it all, a gnawing doubt began to take root. Had it all been in my head? Was I losing my grip on reality? No, I told myself firmly. I knew what I had experienced. The terror had been too real, the pain too visceral to have been a hallucination. But if that was true, why was there no evidence? How had the cabin been repaired so quickly and completely? As the miles rolled by, taking me further from the scene of my nightmare, I found myself questioning everything. Maybe the doctors were right. Maybe the trauma of whatever had actually happened had caused my mind to create this fantastic explanation. But even as these doubts plagued me, another part of my mind rebelled against them. I could still see those intelligent, inhuman eyes, could still feel the creature's hot breath on my face, its crushing grip on my body. That had been real. It had to have been. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was rising on a new day. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my quiet, ordinary house. How could I go back to my normal life after what I'd been through? How could I pretend everything was fine when I knew that there was something out there, something beyond explanation? As I finally dragged myself out of the car, a new resolve began to form. I might not have found the proof I was looking for, but that didn't mean it wasn't out there. Someone, somewhere, must have encountered this creature before. There had to be others who would believe me. I would find them. I would piece together the truth, no matter how long it took, because the alternative, accepting that I had imagined it all, was too terrifying to contemplate. With a deep breath, I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. My search for answers wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sleep had become my enemy. Each night as I lay in my bed, I dreaded closing my eyes, knowing what horrors awaited me in my dreams. This night was no different. I found myself back in the woods, the dense canopy blocking out all light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then I heard it, the snap of a twig, followed by heavy footsteps. I ran, branches whipping at my face as I stumbled through the darkness. But no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps grew closer, hot breath on the back of my neck, and then massive, hairy hands reaching for me. I jolted awake with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat and tangled in my sheets. My eyes darted around the dimly lit room, searching for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. Just the familiar shadows of my bedroom. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was only 3 a.m. With a groan, I dragged myself out of bed. There was no point trying to sleep again. Not after that. As I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, a floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But the hallway was empty. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered, running a shaky hand through my hair. "You're home. You're safe." But was I? The rational part of my brain knew the creature couldn't be here, in my apartment in the middle of the city. But the part of me that had experienced its terrifying reality wasn't so sure. Every shadow seemed to move. Every unexpected sound made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator became a low, menacing growl. The rustle of leaves outside my window transformed into the sound of something massive moving through underbrush. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, lights blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. When dawn finally broke, I felt like I'd aged years in a single night. As days passed, the lack of sleep and constant state of hypervigilance began to take its toll. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I lost weight, food tasting like ash in my mouth. But worst of all was the growing isolation. My friends and family, initially sympathetic to my ordeal, grew increasingly frustrated with my obsession. Every conversation somehow circled back to Bigfoot, to my desperate need for validation. "Ethan, man, you've got to let this go," Mark said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "It's not healthy. You need to talk to someone, get some help." "I don't need help," I snapped. "I need people to believe me, to understand what I went through." Mark sighed, and I could practically see him pinching the bridge of his nose in exasperation. "Look, I get that something traumatic happened to you out there. But Bigfoot, come on. You have to see how crazy that sounds." "It's not crazy," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why won't anyone believe me?" "Because it's impossible, Ethan," Mark shouted, his patience finally snapping. "Bigfoot isn't real. It's a myth, a legend. Whatever happened to you out there, it wasn't that. You need to accept it and move on." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, a mixture of anger and hurt churning in my gut. How could I make them understand? How could I convince them of the truth when I had no proof? As weeks turned into months, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends stopped calling. Family visits became strained, filled with worried glances and whispered conversations when they thought I couldn't hear. But I couldn't let it go. I spent hours online, scouring forums and websites dedicated to Bigfoot sightings. I pored over blurry photos and shaky video footage, desperate for something, anything, that matched what I had seen. One night, as I sat at my computer, eyes burning from hours of staring at the screen, a movement outside my window caught my attention. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head. There, just beyond the glass, I saw a large, dark shape. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw the glint of intelligent eyes watching me. I leapt to my feet, knocking over my chair in my haste. But by the time I reached the window, the shape was gone. The street below was empty, no sign of anything unusual. "No," I whispered, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. "No, no, no. It can't be here. It can't." But a part of me wondered, had it followed me? Had it somehow tracked me down, determined to finish what it had started in those woods? I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my living room, lights blazing, a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hands. Every creak of the building, every distant siren had me flinching, expecting to see that massive, fur-covered form bursting through my door. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across my apartment, I finally dragged myself to the bathroom. The face that stared back at me from the mirror was barely recognizable. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, a wild, unkempt beard. I looked like a man on the edge of sanity, and maybe I was. "What's happening to me?" I whispered to my reflection. "Am I losing my mind?" But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. I wasn't crazy. What I had experienced in those woods was real. The terror, the pain, the sheer impossibility of that creature, it had all happened. But how could I prove it? How could I make others understand when I had no evidence, when the very idea flew in the face of everything they believed possible? As I stared into my own haunted eyes, a chilling realization settled over me. Maybe I would never escape the shadow of what had happened in those woods. Maybe I was doomed to relive that terror for the rest of my life, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if those inhuman eyes were watching me from the darkness. But one thing was certain. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. I needed answers, closure, some way to put this nightmare behind me once and for all. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone. It was time to take action, to seek out others who might believe me. Because if I didn't, if I let this consume me completely, I feared I might truly lose myself to the lingering shadow of that terrible night in the woods. As I dialed the number, my resolve strengthened. I would find the truth no matter where it led me. And maybe, just maybe, I would finally be able to lay this nightmare to rest.